Hello, everybody. Hopefully that spinning fan isn't going to annoy everybody. Let's see if we can get that out of the frame there. Okay. Hey, everybody. It's been a while. Trying to post a couple of videos here tonight. This is live. Feel free to jump in the chat if you're around and and feel like chatting. Okay, so this video is in response to a comment I got on another video. And the commenter was asking what's the difference between polar and inferior when it comes to functions. Um, and I'm going to riff on that a little and try to explain the difference that I see, but have to preface everything by acknowledging that we're sort of mixing um, models or frameworks here, where the inferior function, the concept of that really comes from the MBTI world, and um, where they sort of talk about the dominant function being your first function, and then your inferior function being your fourth function, and that those two functions are in a way sort of pitted against each other, where if you're an INFJ and your lead introverted intuition, is your lead function, then your inferior function is going to be sort of the quote unquote opposite of that in MBTI world, which would be extroverted sensing. And the classic example would be, you're so caught up in your dominant introverted intuition, you're sort of in your head thinking about all the, how the puzzle pieces are supposed to fit together to give you the true answer of how something is or is not. That you're sort of ignoring the outside world, right? You're stuck in daydream world. You're stuck in your head, and you're sort of losing sight of external stimuli, and not only that, but like sort of data that might go against your intuition. So you're so convinced that you're right based off of your NI that you're sort of ignoring all the evidence, that might be counter to what you're thinking. So, for example, I might use my NI to think that, that the Cubs are just destined to win the World Series this year, based off of my intuition and the way that I see, you know, the patterns unfolding and blah 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 blah. But I'm ignoring the fact that, they're missing critical pieces of, championship level teams, or hitting or pitching or whatever, right? So I'm ignoring some, critical pieces of data and just relying on my introverted intuition. And and that, and you could fall into traps like, cognitive bias and stuff like that. And or alternatively, if introverted thinking is your dominant function, and so therefore extroverted feeling would be your fourth function, and therefore your inferior function in MBTI world, you're so caught up on sort of precision and making sure everything makes analytical sense that you sort of l- ignore the social grace, right? So you might find yourself in a situation where you're, correcting somebody's grammar, or somebody might have said something where everybody understands what they meant, but they didn't really say it precisely, and you're using your TI, and you sort of ignore the social grace, and you're correcting them when it's probably not necessary. Um, that kind of thing. And then alternatively, if somebody's got strong, dominant introverted feeling, they might ignore the extroverted thinking part of it, right? So they're so caught up on, how they feel about a certain situation or the ethics behind it, that they're sort of losing sight of the practical, um, the pragmatics of the situation. We just need to get this thing done. And, you might not like it the way that we're doing it, but you got to break a few omelets, that kind of thing, right? To get this particular goal accomplished or whatever. Um, so that is sort of the classic MBTI way of looking at sort of dominant versus inferior. Socionics, which again, I completely admit that I'm no expert in socionics whatsoever. And so all the socionics bros you don't need to swoop down and tell me how wrong I am on this. But I get it. Um, but socionics came up with the idea of the polar function, and instead of it being the fourth function, what you're really looking at is the seventh function. And so the way to think about that, the way that I think about it, is you look at your second function, your tool function, and what is the quote unquote opposite of that? But it's not opposite in the MBTI sense. It's opposite in more of a socionics or defensible typology sense of, if your second function is introverted thinking, that's a deliberate introverted thinking is a deliberation function. And so what's the other deliberation function? Well, that's introverted feeling. So both of those functions are trying to derive a conclusion. You're trying to, you're presented with a question and you're trying to come up with a conclusion. You're deliberating, thinking through the problem space, and then trying to come up with an answer or a conclusion. And you could do that in a TI way, or you could do that in an FI way. And it sort of depends on what the question is a lot of times. But sometimes, even with the same question, some people might have a TI approach versus an FI approach. And so if your second function is your tool function, that's sort of what you're, in my mind, I think that is the one that you're sort of consciously aware of the most of using. Like your dominant function is just sort of on autopilot and it's just sort of running. And yeah, you spend a lot of your attention in that function, but as you're using active attention, where you're actively trying to, exercise your mind muscles, I would argue you're spending a lot of time in your second function. And then, and what that causes is an inhibition of the seventh function, right? So if you're constantly in your FI deliberation function and you're coming up with conclusions and answers to questions in FI world, your brain literally is inhibiting the TI part, right? Because it's using so much resource for the FI part that it's inhibiting the TI part. Or alternatively, let's say your second function is introverted intuition. So that's a knowledge function. The other knowledge function is introverted sensing or SI. So your introverted intuition is constantly inhibiting your SI. So um, and so when you're sort of navigating your knowledge space, you're more likely to navigate your NI and suppress your SI. So the ENTJs and the ENFJs are suppressing that SI information, that those rules. Watch my Leroy Jenkins video. They're going full Leroy Jenkins because they're ignoring the SI information and just relying on their NI, their intuition, to solve whatever problem they're trying to solve. Okay. So what's really the difference? Few ways of thinking about it. Going back to the inferior, I think of the fourth function as it's still in your front stack. So to the extent you want to talk about being bad versus good at a function, you're still okay at it. I mean, you're not as great at it as somebody where it's their dominant function, because there it's just sort of effortless, right? And it's not, and when I talk about being good or bad at a function, it's sort of shorthand for really what I'm saying is how much attention and how much resource do you have to spend for your brain to use that function. And the example I like to use is SE is my fourth function. I can do it, but I got to spend a lot of attentional resources on it. And the example I like to use is like catching a pop fly in baseball, where like you're standing there, the ball, and you have to engage your SE as you're trying to catch this ball, and it just seems to be hovering, indefinitely forever, and you have to just spin that attentional focus, concentrating in the SE world, and you can't be thinking NI stuff or NE stuff or anything else like that. You have to be focusing on SE. And when it's your fourth function, that's a lot harder than when it's your first function or your first two functions. And so, it's going to be harder for me to catch a pop fly than it is for like somebody who's like a ISTP or an ESTP, where SE is sort of higher up in the stack, and it's easier for them to devote their attention to that kind of stuff. Or the other thing I think about is, I grew up playing the drums and different musical instruments, and I could do it for a while, but like, after a while, like, if you're playing the drums, like you have to like stay on beat and play, basically the same groove for maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 15 minutes, and if SE is sort of inferior, you kind of start losing track of it, right? Your mind starts going to other places. Where somebody where like they're just dominant SE, they could just go, very effortlessly, um, because they don't need to spend that much attentional resource, or it doesn't require them to spend more attentional resources than it does where it's sort of lower on the stack. So I also think of the fourth function as sort of the function that you don't really trust it. You're okay with it. You don't trust it though. And so you like to get help from other people when you're engaging in it. And so if your fourth function is SE, anytime you're out sort of doing action stuff in the world, you'd like to have somebody there helping you with it. So I think of even just like mundane tasks like, painting your room, right? Or painting the inside of your house or whatever. Yeah, you could do it. It's not that hard, but just the intentional resource of having to just stick with it for, maybe hours on end as you're putting multiple layers on and you're taping things up, and just having that attentional focus. To me, it's so much easier if I have somebody else doing it with me. Not necessarily, to do the work for me, but to just kind of do it with me, right? Um, and most things that I think of that are sort of heavy SE types of things, like I'd like to have somebody there to sort of keep me on task, right? Or to keep my attention there. Because otherwise I know I'm just going to get lost in I world, and I'll have a half painted room, and I'll just be like, oh, I'll just leave it this way. I'll get back to it eventually, kind of thing. But if you have somebody, it helps. And if you think of other functions, let's say you're an ISTJ and NE is your fourth function. You could do any stuff, but you like to sort of bounce ideas off of people, I think. So rather than just sitting there coming up with all your any ideas, like maybe an ENTP or an ENFP would on their own, they could just sit there and just, write or talk or whatever for hours on their own. If it's your fourth function, like a ISFJ or an ISTJ, you probably want somebody there to sort of bounce ideas off of, rather than trying to do it all on your own, because otherwise you just sort of get tired of doing it, I would say. Um, and that's why I think like lead introverted feelers like ISFPs, INFPs, when they're sort of trying to plan things like a TE type of stuff, you see this a lot in INFPs and ISFPs too, where they want to bounce the plan off of you. Like, do you think this is going to work? Um, rather than just doing it, rather than just coming up with a plan and doing it. They like to talk about it. They like to talk through and make sure that they're thinking about it the right way, and this is what they should be doing. Um, yeah. So, and then, yeah. So any sort of lead function, the fourth function is going to be the MBTI opposite of it. So extroverted feeling, introverted thinking would be the MBTI opposite of it. And again, that's sort of what you like to bounce ideas off of people, that kind of thing, just sort of engage in that function using other people. Um, and again, a lot of it is just because it takes a lot of attentional resource, and having somebody else to sort of help you with that energy, I think is one of the driving reasons. That, and you don't really trust it, right? So if you're trying to come up with a TE plan, it might make sense to you, but you realize, like, maybe I should bounce this off of somebody, and talk about it with them, get their input, because I don't necessarily trust it. All right. Hey, I got a comment. Shawarma with Shani. Hey, buddy. Hey, yourself. Hope you're doing well out there in personality land. You got any questions, let me know. Okay, so now compare that to polar. So polar is not just like you don't trust it, So like with an INFJ, let's use me as an example. TE polar. It's not that I would feel better if I just had somebody helping me with the TE like an INFP would. It's like, I just don't want to do the TE at all. Right? I would much rather, TE is an engagement function where you're trying to problem solve, well, it's goal oriented problem solving, trying to get from point A to point B. And I would much rather, here is where I just much rather have somebody else do it, right? So if my watch stops working, or if my car stops working, I'm not going to call a friend over and say, "Hey, can you help me fix my watch or fix my car?" Like, I am just going to take it to an expert who knows how to do it. Like, I'm not even going to try to get into that mental space, right? And so it's not so much of just like trying to find a buddy to keep you engaged and to keep you on task, or to bounce ideas off of. It's like, we're just gonna, delegate this out to somebody else. And I've, been around long enough to know that, it's much easier than, rather than me trying to figure out how to fix a computer and watching a YouTube video, or how to fix an engine or something like that by watching YouTube videos. It's just easier for me to just find somebody else to do it. Um, it'll save a lot of pain in the long run, and that's polar function. And it's almost as if you just don't, that it really is a blind spot. And I realize other models out there, other systems talk about blind spots, and the fourth spot being the blind spot, but I don't see it as the blind spot, the fourth spot, your slot, right? Your fourth function. To me, you're still conscious of it. You're still okay with doing it. You don't trust yourself doing it, so you'd rather just sort of have somebody help you, but you're still going to engage in the function. Where when it comes to polar, like, you would just rather not have to engage at all and get somebody else to do it for you. Now, of course, we're all responsible adults here, and we all realize that you can't delegate out everything that is TE. You're going to have to do some of it, so you pick and choose your battles. But to But again, it's an engagement function, it's goal oriented. And so, to the extent I can use FE to solve it, I'll use FE as opposed to TE. So, here's another example that I like to use. So, when I was in law school, there's a funny thing about law school in the way that they do the grading, or at least the way classically, some law schools have changed just because of the times, but the classic way of running a law school would be you take everybody has to take the the same classes their first year, and you take 3 or 4 of your first semester and 3 or 4 of your second semester, and everybody's pretty much taking the same classes. And by and large, your grade is what is based off of one exam that they give you at the end of the year, right? So it's not a series of pop quizzes or homework or assignments or group projects or anything like that. It's one test, one exam at the end of the year, and it covers all of the material that you learn throughout the semester. Okay. And so, as you can imagine, in law school, because everything hinges on your grades and all that, it's very stressful. And you have a lot of different personality types and a lot of different people trying to figure out the best way to get an A, right? Or to be successful. And so you'll see a lot of people just fall into various cognitive function traps. A lot of people will take the TE approach. They'll come up with a system and they want to outline everything and they want to highlight everything. And, they might even have like like a study schedule that they plot out. You can imagine the sheer amount of TE that goes into studying for these exams, right? And they probably spend more time trying to figure out their TE system for studying than they actually spend studying, right? And like, learning the material as opposed to just figuring out, like, okay, here's my little TE plan. And so, so surrounded by a lot of people. In law school gets a lot of heavy TE users just by virtue of the type of people who like to go to law school. And so you have all these people who are just like planners, and they've got this whole study system and groups and schedules and outlines and everything, and they're just TEing everything up because that's all they know. It's like, if I have a goal, I need to come up with a plan, and here's the plan. And of course, there's a bunch of books out there of how to study and stuff, and so they'll just sort of spend their time doing that. Where somebody like me, who is more of an FE user, what I did was I just studied the professors who were teaching the class. And I would go in and I would talk to them during their office hours. I would definitely pay attention during class. I try to engage with them the most I could. And the reason that I would is I wanted to know what types of things were important to them. And different professors have different things that are important to them. And whatever is important to them is what's going to show up on the exam. And the other thing you could do is you could go and look at old exams, that they had on file at the library. And so I sort of like put my professors into different buckets, and they are very different personality types. Like, we had this old school prosecutor, who was very systematic and very analytical, but he also cared very deeply about, like, particular social issues that had to do with the criminal justice system. It was criminal law. And so you pick up on that. Your FE sort of just picks up on those signals. Where another professor was a torts professor, and he was like a hardcore, like, communist socialist, like very into the labor rights, and basically felt like the labor class should be running the country. And so the types of things that were going to be important to him on the exam were those sorts of things, right? So I didn't really know what they were going to ask. I didn't really know what exactly the answers were, but I knew what to focus on. Like, what do they care about versus what do they not care about? And what are they going to be looking for in an exam? and things like that. So it wasn't about coming up with a TE, like I'm going to study from, 9 o'clock to noon and then get lunch and then study this next subject from noon to 4, and have note cards and highlights. I didn't do any of that. And I would just sort of bounce ideas off of other people in class, and do sort of, practice questions, things like that. But again, it was really about knowing the professors and knowing what they cared about that to me worked. Now, was that going to work for everybody? No, because not everybody's an FE user and it's just going to be gobbledygook to them. In the same way that their TE planning was gobbledygook to me, right? And so there were definitely some TE users who did very well as well. Like they had their system and they figured out, how to study in their own way. Um, and that's the difference of polar, right? Where you 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 really just don't engage in that function if you don't have to. Um, because you could solve whatever mental function you're trying to do, you can use a different system to do it, right? So I could use FE to quote unquote study for my law school exams, where if I just told somebody that, like, oh, just pay attention to the professor, just like, figure out what makes them tick and what they're all about, that would make no sense to somebody who's FE polar, right? If I told that to an ISTJ or an INTJ, like there's no way that they could do that and be successful, right? But on the other hand, they probably had very good TE systems for studying and, getting themselves from point A to point B, that if they told me, oh yeah, just do it this way, I would give up after, giving it a half-ass try, because it just in my mind doesn't make sense, right? I want to focus on other things. Um, so to me, that's the difference between polar and inferior. Where inferior, you're willing to give it a college try. You'd like to have some help with it, mainly to just sort of keep you on task, and to keep your attention focused on whatever the task is at hand. Or again, you might not trust it that much, and you just want to bounce ideas off of people, things like that. Where polar, it really is like you'd rather just not use it and you're going to use the other function. So if you're polar in a knowledge function, you're just, again, you might ignore SI stuff and just rely purely on the NI stuff, or vice versa. If you're NI polar, like an ESTJ or an ESFJ, I mean, watch my video on the lady who I would argue is NI polar, and she's just rattling on with the SI information and doesn't give any NI, you know, any sort of intentional resource to NI stuff. Like she's not even trying to figure out what's going on or why things happen. Or, she's not, if you watch, she doesn't use a single metaphor, a single, analogy. She's not trying to come up with a pattern, an explanation, figuring out why something happened. She just wants you to know what happened, in a very SI way, and is completely ignoring any sort of NI thought, except right at the end, where I think she kind of realized that she probably went on for 20 minutes giving you the SI stuff, that she made some sort of comment of like, well, it was just sort of a bad situation, it was bad all around, which was kind of her best attempt at coming up with an NI explanation for what had happened. And so when you watch those types of videos, just watch how they just, how in her video, because she's on this SI rant, she's completely ignoring anything NI. And again, if she had just sort of stopped and thought, why was this happening? What, like put yourself in the other person's shoes, in the person who works at the store, just for one, 10 seconds, put yourself in their shoes. And why did they say what they said? Why did they say they had the candles when they didn't? Like, what would explain somebody just making an innocent mistake like that? But no, no, she wanted nothing to do with that. She just wanted to focus on the SI stuff. Um, and so there it really is a blind spot in the true sense of the word, where it's just not even there, right? I mean, they're just filling in the way that we fill in our blind spot with visual information, our literal blind spot with visual information. They're filling in, the NI hole with SI stuff, right? And and if I'm TE polar, I'm filling in the TE hole with FE stuff, right? Hey, bro, another commenter here. Good to see everybody here. It's been a while, like I said. I've been moving, switching job. I switched job. It's been a while, but I need to stop using that excuse. But I've been moving and adapting to a new city, and so I haven't been on for a while. So it's good to see everybody. Hopefully, nothing too drastic has changed in the personality world. I'm sure it's the same fights we've all been having. Okay, there was another comment I wanted to address here. Let me see if I can find. I have no idea how to navigate this stupid. Okay, so I talked about inferior versus polar. I think you get the point. Let's see here. I have another question. This is a different comment. I have another question. What do you think of the distinctions in personality flavors described by personality hackers here on YouTube? Assertive, artistic, normalizing, harmonizing, INFJ. Yeah. But this distinction appears applicable to all types. Yeah. Okay. So this goes to the slicing and dicing thing, and I've made a couple of videos on it. Look for one of the videos. I think it's actually called "It Slices, It Dices," where I go into this, where there's sort of these subtypes of the various types, and a few things to say about that. So, first of all, I think it's just sort of TI gone amok, right? Like TI just starts to want to analyze and analyze and analyze and analyze and dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and it refuses to accept that it's just turtles all the way down, right? It wants to, once you've sort of unpacked one concept, it wants to keep unpacking it, until you get sort of to the fundamental life source of consciousness or whatever, right? But it's just going to keep breaking it down because that's what TI does. And obviously in personality world, we have a lot of TI users. This is just ripe for TI's, analytical stuff. And sometimes just a general description is just not enough, right? We need to break it down into more. And in academia, they talk about the lumpers versus the splitters, where the lumpers are the scientists or the theoretical minds out there that are trying to unite different concepts, like trying to come up with a universal theory of everything. Can we explain gravity and electromagnetism and quantum mechanics and strong force and weak force and all that with one explanation, like one force that explains it all? Those are the lumpers. They're trying to figure out, the sort of the key underlying phenomenon that explains all these different components. But you also have the splitters, and the splitters again they're very analytical, and they want to keep breaking things down and explaining it. And that's where you get socionics, right? Where And again, I'm not an expert but I've seen like the socionics tables where it's just like 40 different, like every personality type has these 40 different characteristics, and you got to have all 40 of them, or you're not whatever you say you are. um and also with the objective personality model, Shannon and I'm drawing a blank on his name, but you guys all know. And how they have like 512 different personality types. And, from somebody who taught statistics at a graduate level, like that just doesn't work. You can't have a classification system that has that many different variables. Just because once you start introducing that number of degrees of freedom, it's impossible to have a method of selecting which category you fall into or which type you are without the error rate being so big that you can believe anything, right? So, in other words, if you have 512 different personality types, the probability of picking somebody and putting them in the right category, they're in category 417, not 416, not 418, not 32, not 222, but 416, the probability of being correct is like infinitesimally small, right? To the point where it's just not worth doing. Okay. So when people want to sort of slice and dice all these, the 416 or 8 types into, smaller and smaller types, yeah, they're trying to find something to hang their hat on, something that's new and interesting to talk about and to characterize. But you start getting into like statistical, you know, thunderstorms that you just can't get out of. And so I would caution against that, just from a pure statistical standpoint, you know. But the other thing is, you also see the academics, what's her name? I'm really blanking on a lot of people's names. I'm getting too old or something. What's she's a professor, I think, out in Arizona, Brennan or something, does really like high quality work in academia. And you have Professor Nardi, and you have um, what's his name, the Kiersey model, and they sort of made their names off of sort of rearranging and repackaging types and subtypes. And the other thing you have to think about is in academia, you have to sort of come up with new things, because you can't just say I'm the world's expert in MBTI and then just keep regurgitating the same explanation for things for 20, 30, 40 years. You don't make an academic career out of that. And so what you have to do is you have to find new ways of slicing and dicing the data or the information to come up with new subtypes or subgroupings or things like that, so that there's something new to publish and there's something new to talk about, something new to present at a conference. Because otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels in academia, and you can't advance your career. And so you see a lot of this in academia, just all across the board, not just in personality types, but learning and memory and attention and executive function, and just anything in psychology. Every 3 or 4 years, you have somebody sort of coming out of nowhere and saying, everything you thought about this is wrong. Here's a new way of thinking about it, or here's a new way of repackaging the data. And sometimes they're right, and sometimes it is exciting, it is a new way of thinking about it, but a lot of times they're just trying to make a name for themselves, and they're sort of saying that they've come up with a new way of explaining things or categorizing things, when really it's just kind of the same thing that people have been saying for 20 years or whatever. Um, and so in my slices and dices video, I talk about, if you just go to the Wikipedia page for temperament type, you'll see that, just going back to the ancient Greeks, there's basically four temperaments. And there have been hundreds of different models, that are significant enough that they made it to Wikipedia, right? Where they're trying to slice and dice and describe personality types or temperaments or however you want to think about it in new and exciting ways. But if you really think about it, fundamentally on sort of this NI level, they're all saying the same thing, that there's basically four ways of breaking people up, into different groups. And Jung did it, the ancient Greeks did it, MBTI does it, Kiersey does it, Brent, everybody who's coming up with some sort of system. It essentially boils down to these, the four temperaments that the ancient Greeks came up with. You can pretty much fit them in one category or another. But we just it's discourse. This whole personality psychology, psychological types thing. It's just discourse. It's just us finding ways to describe a phenomenon because we can't measure it. As much as Nardi wants to, is sort of fighting the good fight and trying to find a way to measure this stuff using ERP data or brain scans or whatever he's using these days. Very, very hard. There's a lot of a priori assumptions that go into doing that. And really, it fundamentally comes down to just, figuring out a way or new ways of describing things, using different words to sort of create different verbal fences. Now, that being said, I think there are some models that build those verbal fences in a way that are better than other models, because they break down into real world phenomena a little bit better. Like, for example, the Eric's defensible typology approach, it breaks down the functions into computational functions, functions that computer, like any computational processor or entity or thing would need, right? There's four types of information that any sort of computational structure needs. And he breaks down those functions into those four things. But it turns out for each of those four things, there's two ways of doing it. Our brains have sort of evolved a left brain and right brain way of doing things. So, for example, TI versus FI. So we can come to conclusions about questions. So they can ask us whether something is or is not the case, or is or should not be, or ought not to be. And we can use either TI or FI to come up with an answer to those deliberative type of questions. Same thing for problem solving in the real world with goal-oriented behavior. We could either do it in a very mechanical way using machines to help us, or we can use people to help us. And our brain, we have a right brain, left brain dichotomy, where the left brain is more about the machines and the right brain is more about the people. And also, just even within left brain, right brain, there's different structures doing TE and FE type of stuff. And that's just sort of the beauty of being human, that that we can figure out different ways to approach it, right? Same problem, but you can use an FE versus a TE type of approach. Also, with your knowledge base, you can use knowledge that you've gained through direct experience, or you can use knowledge where you've sort of read between the lines and you've come up with sort of a theory or a pattern that, even though you didn't directly experience it, you were able to sort of piece together the way that the world pretty much works, even though, nobody told you that it's that way. So, where am I going with this? Right. So you've got these four different types of computational processing going on, and two approaches for each processing type. And that's all you need, right? You don't need to slice and dice it anymore. And to the extent we're trying to describe people and their behaviors and why somebody acts irritated versus, keeps it all in, that's just descriptive. You're not, unless you could boil it down to a function, like what are they computing? What function are they engaging in? Um, Everything else is just descriptive. And there's lots of other things that go into somebody's personality that's not just the cognitive functions, right? Like, just how neurotic people are, how narcissistic they are, how sadistic they might be, how nice they might be. I mean, that's not necessary. You can have extroverted feeling types that are assholes. Not all extroverted feeling types are nice, bubbly people like yours truly. But yeah, and that isn't necessarily that's not the cognitive function. That's something else. That's sort of some other, spice, getting in there, that the cognitive functions itself don't really explain. And so I think that's why you start seeing this. Every type has these four subtypes to it. So again, I'm more of a lumper. It's an NI thing. I mean, NI people are going to be more likely to be lumpers, right? We're trying to find a fundamental underlying um, explanation to things as opposed to the NETI types that are like constantly trying to analyze and come up with new explanations to stuff. So your INTPs and your ENTPs are the ones who are, your socionic bros who are just coming up with these tables of 40 different things, that are, kind of unnecessary, in my mind, when everything can be explained in a much more universal way. Okay, I guess I've ranted long enough. Hope everybody's doing well out there. Keep coming with the comments. I promise I'll try to be better about responding. I did post two videos tonight as well. One on my ongoing series of great moments in polar history. I expect this one to be a little controversial. It's the Leroy Jenkins one because um, I can imagine most people think that he is a totally different personality type than I have him pegged as. But hopefully, you get the point I'm trying to make in the video. Um, and I'm still trying to find good examples of other polar moments. If you have any recommendations, or if there's some sort of video out there that's kind of funny where somebody is clearly kind of off the rails in one way or another, point it out to me, let me know, and we might be able to dissect it and make some sense out of it. But who knows? All right, talk to everybody later, and have a good day. Bye.